Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And we have a special show today because we have a guest from outside our organization, as well as, of course, our Vice President for Research, Todd Myers. We're also speaking with Kurt Miller. He's the CEO and Executive Director of NWPPA, the Northwest Public Power Association. And of course, Kurt, I think for most people, the first question is, what is the NWPPA? What do you do? And because you're associated with public power, why don't you just give us an overall view of where Washington is in terms of power supply?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, David, thank you so much for being here or inviting me to be here, rather. I guess you were going to be here anyway. And then also to Todd. Todd's a longtime friend and respected colleague, and I'm really honored to have him join us today. Just like I said, worked with Todd for several years, and he brings a lot to the table. So anyway, I'm really excited about a good dialogue today. So first of all, NWPPA, Northwest Public Power Association, we represent 154 not-for-profit or community-owned electric utilities across 10 Western states, including Washington State. And kind of per our chat before the session began, public power is unique, and there's a very big public power presence in Washington State. And it's different. So basically, when we say public power, we mean not-for-profit utilities. And that is kind of different than maybe, let's say, Puget Sound Energy or Avista or investor-owned utilities that are out there. And there's a lot of similarities between those two sets of utilities in terms of the type. But the biggest distinction is that community-owned utilities, 100% of their costs essentially go through directly to the local customer, and if there was any profit, 100% would go, to the local customer. For an IOU or an investor-owned utility, they essentially earn a rate of return on their investments, and that rate of return goes to the shareholders. So in the IOU case, you have shareholders and customers, and in the consumer-owned utility space, you just have customers. And that can change the incentives for folks, but I'm not really here to talk about that today, just here to kind of share about that. Washington State itself, about 2/3 of all of its electric customers are served by community-owned electric utilities. So that's a really large portion. Let's say if you look to Oregon, just its southern neighbor, only about 1/3 are served by public power utilities. So there's a big distinction between electricity providers in Oregon and Washington State. And then to get to your bigger question of what is the state of affairs with electricity in Washington State. And I'll just say, and maybe across the broader Pacific Northwest, things have really changed. I've been in the business, kind of in the utility sector for over 30 years. I started my career at the Bonneville Power Administration. I also worked for 20 years for an investor-owned utility in Portland, Oregon. So I've gotten to see quite a bit over that time, and really things started to change when Oregon and Washington both passed renewable portfolio standards. So before then, you'd have great big kind of natural gas generators, coal generators. We have one nuclear generator in the region, and those generators were really good at kind of turning up and down their output to meet whatever variations in demand that there were. And that system had worked, for over 100 years, and it worked pretty well. But as concerns about climate change came up, and then especially West Coast states started to put in renewable portfolio standards or RPSs, all of a sudden you started to see a really big growth, especially at first in the Northwest, in wind generation. And so all of a sudden, in I think like a 10-year period, about 10,000 megawatts of nameplate wind generation was built. And that totally changed the perspective in terms of how do you go about planning to meet your demand on a moment-by-moment basis, knowing that your output from wind generation is also changing on its own on a moment-to-moment basis, right? So before you just had one area of variability, which was your electric demand, now you introduced two areas of variability. Both your supply and demand have a lot more variability. So that's been a big challenge. Then we'll more recently add on mandates for electrification. So as you know, the Clean Energy Transformation Act in Washington State means that that 100% of Washington's electricity has to be, first of all, generated by 100% non-carbon emitting generation by 2045. But then also there's a really big push to electrify the transportation sector, which I know that you guys are very familiar with, and then also with home and business heating. And so just a couple of years ago, Washington Department of Commerce said that that even without major changes in demand growth, organically, that they expected that Washington's demand for electricity would literally double. Now, then the demand for maybe natural gas would be diminishing, but the demand for electricity to serve that new demand would double. Now, that's an incredible amount of load growth or demand growth or load growth, is we use those interchangeably, over like a 20-year period. So that's a huge challenge. And now more recently, as everyone's aware from the media, we're seeing huge demand changes from data centers, especially to try to supply what seems like an insatiable appetite for electricity from AI. And so in Washington State is one of the places where that AI demand is showing up because of our strong high-tech sector. The biggest place actually is in Virginia, where just huge amounts of demand being placed there. But Washington State, because it does have fairly affordable, reliable electricity, has been another place where that's happening. So the challenge has become really acute, and we saw that basically a year and a half ago. We got some extremely cold weather at the same time that there was a planned transmission outage. And all of a sudden, multiple utilities in the Pacific Northwest had to declare level 3 energy emergency alerts, which basically meant that they were the next step to try to keep the grid in balance was to actually forcibly shut down customers. And so we call those rolling blackouts, where they take sections at a time. And the problem is, of course, that's happening when people need the electricity the most, right? It's not such a big deal if it's 70 degrees out and you don't have electricity. I mean, for some people, that's a big deal depending on what equipment they need for their health and things like that. But in general, that's not a huge hardship. The problem is that when the demand is the greatest, that's a concern, and that's usually when you're at risk of losing power. Last thing I'll say, and because this is both a Northwest issue and national issue, in 2024, the the grid policeman of the West, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, made the following assessment. The pace of change is increasing the risks to reliability across North America. The supply of electricity is not growing fast enough to keep up with demand growth. What was once a simple problem of supply and demand has become complicated by rapid change and increasing variability. Unless we prioritize reliability as the resource mix evolves and becomes more variable, we are at risk for serious and more frequent disruptions, i.e. blackouts. The West must move quickly and more decisively to ensure resource adequacy over the next decade. And there's a slew of other reports that kind of confirm that finding. Most recently, the Department of Energy just this month released a report on resource adequacy, and it says basically the same thing. So, Washington State, even though we have a great hydropower resource, we are still at risk.
So part of the big problem there, it sounds to me, and you might not want to get into this area, but you can just tell me if I'm right or wrong. It sounds to me like one of the large problems is it's not so much, what you were saying, but it's political mandates that require you to not prioritize stability or reliability, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think it's obviously it's a sensitive area because we we want to have good relationships with our policymakers and things like that. But I will say this, that I firmly believe that you cannot be getting rid of, let's say, natural gas plants is a great example, right? And unless you can replace them with generation that has similar characteristics.
So
And
the
so the
problem
problem,
exists.
yeah.
I'm sorry. So the problem exists because we've kind of imposed it on ourselves, pursuing a different value without recognizing that there are competing values that are also essential in the
Yes,
market.
absolutely. And I think the problem is you do have some groups out there, some in the environmental NGO world who are like, oh, you can get rid of this and it's not a problem and you can do it cheaper. And Todd has done battle with some of those groups and questioned them on some of their numbers. But they, to the average policymaker who maybe isn't completely steeped in what it takes to keep the grid operating, what they say sounds pretty good, but the truth is, and this is not me bashing on wind or solar power, but those plants don't do the same things, right? Those plants, they produce energy when the resource is available, and they don't produce energy when the resource isn't available. When there's no wind or there's no sunshine, they don't produce, right? And so, whereas a natural gas plant essentially is always ready to produce. And so you can't get rid of the reliable one or the on-demand one and replace it with kind of what I would call like a non-on-demand generation and then expect the grid's going to work the same way.
Todd, I know you have questions as well, and I could follow up all day, but I want to give you a chance to jump in here and describe, your reaction to what's being said and pose any question that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think there's several things. First, with regard to public power versus investor-owned, the one thing we have to remember is that investor-owned utilities are heavily regulated. They have to get their rates approved, and they also have lots of regulations about the goals, the targets that they have to meet. So, I think that the distinction between public power and investor-owned is real to some extent, but it's not as acute as some people make it out to. And then, of course, within the public sector, there's a very big difference between Benton PUD and Seattle City Light. Those are very different utilities and have very different goals because they're run by the political entities that are local. One of the things, though, I think I want to add to what Kurt said about grid reliability is that we've been very fortunate because we have so much hydro. Washington is super unique in how much hydro we have, and hydro, for the large part, can play the role that natural gas plays, which is that you can ramp it up or ramp it down as demand goes up and demand goes down. And what you see on a sort of an average day is that, the sun goes up in the middle of the day and then it comes down, and then wind kind of comes up at night. But in between, where sun is going down and wind is coming up, is actually where the peak demand is, the highest demand. So the irony is that the gap between wind and solar is where we need the most electricity. That is what is being served now by hydro or by natural gas. And one of the things I wrote a report earlier this year that was published by the Heritage Foundation looking at climate change, the impact that it will have on hydro. And one of the things that came out of that is that as you have more intermittent sources like wind and solar, you then have to save those resources like hydro and natural gas for those gaps. And that makes it more expensive to run hydro and natural gas. So it's not merely the increase in cost because solar and wind, unsubsidized, are more expensive. They are. But also, if you have too much of those, it makes other resources that have to fill those gaps more expensive as well. And so that, I think, is the challenge, is that you not only have to worry about resource adequacy, do we have enough at any time of the day to provide the demand, but how expensive are those resources that we're turning to rely on to fill in those gaps?
Yeah, that's really well said. I want to piggyback Todd's piggyback if I could. Is that allowed?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that I think that's the issue, is that, some of the environmental NGOs that I mentioned, they'll talk about how wind and solar are, the cheapest energy around. Of course, well then, part of that is subsidization, right? So part of that's subsidies. And even without subsidies, they have come down in price a lot. But the challenge is that to run, like you can run at a certain penetration, those resources, are fine. They're kind of on the side, let's say. They're not at the heart of what you're trying to do with the grid. If you're really trying to run the whole grid on intermittent resources, you have to end up building out those resources almost exponentially. You have to overbuild to make sure that there's always sun shining somewhere, for instance, right? Or wind blowing somewhere. There always has to be enough to meet your needs. And because of the weather dependency of those things, there's a challenge. And of course, the people say, did I not know about batteries? Well, no, I do know about batteries. But the challenge with batteries is that, typically we're talking about 4-hour duration, maybe 8-hour duration batteries. And that's great. I mean, and those have come down in price a lot as well. But, when you're trying to run the grid, your needs go far beyond that. We can have a heat wave that can last 5 days at least. We can have a cold snap that can last 5 days at least. Now, all of a sudden, you get one shot at your batteries, right? And until the weather, moderates again, it's going to be hard to refill those. So, that's the challenge. The challenge is the scale at which we're trying to do some of these things makes them almost physically impossible.
Yeah, just one more thing along those lines, those long stretches. We hit both of the last 2 winters. We have had weeks where in sort of the mountains where I live, or in eastern Washington, it was 0 or below 0. And what you see is no wind during those periods of time. So you're getting very high demand, electricity demand. Fortunately, right now, a lot of that heating is natural gas, but that's going to change, right? We're going to have higher electricity demand during those periods. And what happens to wind? Literally across the Pacific Northwest, it can go to almost 0 for a week. So what do you do during those periods of time? Like batteries, they're expensive and they don't last that long.
For lay people, and I'm sure this is a backtread and an obvious question, but for those of us outside of the lingo, why don't you describe what some of the challenges are for an organization like yours, the Northwest Public Power Association, when you're dealing with intermittent resources? Because you mentioned before that your one challenge was supply and demand, regulating that, but now you have these intermittent sources. How does that put added pressure and or cost on an organization like yours supplying power?
Yeah, so I should be clear. So we are really a trade association. NWPPA is, and we provide training and education to our members, and also
I should say clients like yours.
yeah, and perform advocacy. But I did grow up in the power supply departments of various utilities, and so I think the challenge is, one of the big challenges is it's very hard to forecast, let's say, wind. Wind generation, even a few days out, you'll get a forecast and it will show like maybe a big windstorm or a big wind event is coming, but it doesn't know exactly what hours that's going to happen, right? And so the problem is then the greater the uncertainty, let's say the greater the jaws of uncertainty, that means you have to have more backup generation ready to catch it on both sides, right? So if the wind generation goes way up, that means the other generation you have has to be flexible enough to be able to be ramped down. If the wind generation goes down, that backup generation has to be ready to come up on a moment's notice. And so that uncertainty can make things really, really difficult, because you're trying to outguess the forecast. Or maybe that sounds a little too unscientific, but you're trying to use your best available information to guess what the uncertainty is and then plan for it. But I think the other thing, and Todd really hit on this, wind generation in the Pacific Northwest, especially for the winter, has a reliable capacity factor of, I think, around 5%. And that's probably actually too high. I mean, I don't, as Todd mentioned, if you look in our region, windmills essentially generally are all blowing at the same time, or they're not blowing at all, right? And when you get a real cold event, you end up with almost no generation. Sometimes if you get a big heat event as well, you'll see the same thing, because both in cold events and heat events, you end up with a loss of pressure differentials, which is what causes wind to blow, right? So you can end up with this period of days when you need electricity the most, that wind's not available. In the winter in the Northwest as well, solar is not a great resource because of the angle of the Northwest towards the sun and the shorter days. We end up not having a very good resource there. So again, it's this challenge is of having to build a system that that is ready for both. I almost, I'm going to use an analogy that I haven't thought out really clearly yet, but it's almost like if you're familiar with the Chevrolet, the Chevy Volt, is like it has both electric battery, but then a separate gas engine, because they're not really sure if the battery is going to get them far enough, right, to their spot. So they've got an engine in reserve. So you end up kind of double building, and that's the challenge that I think from a cost perspective, whether you're a consumer-owned utility or an investor-owned utility, the cost challenge is trying to build a reliable system and build it big enough, especially if you're relying on intermittent renewables, that where it's still reliable, but it doesn't cost people more than they can afford to pay for electricity. So I think that's a challenge that, and maybe a particular challenge for consumer-owned utilities is that many of our members serve communities where like there are 10,000 or fewer customers. About half of our members do. And so those tend to be very rural, very economically challenged areas. And so for them, a cost increase for electricity rates can really make a huge difference in terms of making it more difficult for them to make ends meet. So I think maybe that's the one distinction I would say there.
That brings me to another question, which is if you could make an estimate or guesstimate on the regulations and that are mandated on your client companies, how much of the cost of utilities or is attributable to what amounts to unnecessary regulation, or at least unnecessary if you didn't share the priorities or the values of those making those mandates. How much is added to the cost for these individuals, especially those you're talking about? It was exactly what I was thinking of. People who are really, watching every dollar to make their family budget stretch.
Yeah, well, so you guys bring up a great point, and that is an interesting situation with our membership. I mentioned 154 utilities across 10 Western states. And the one thing that seems to be in common is there is like an east-west divide across most of those states. Like the I-5 corridor from Washington to California, has a lot to say with where people think about these things. And I know a lot of our West Side members fully embrace this kind of move to a more decarbonized grid. I think that obviously in the eastern states, or eastern half of these states, or in some of the more eastern states in our territory, there's more resistance and questioning about whether or not that's money well spent. But I think the biggest, probably the biggest sensitivity is from our members who are economically challenged. The rural communities are very challenged. And so from them, there just isn't a lot of economic opportunity to offset an increase in basic goods. So I think that's a big challenge. In terms of how much of the cost of it, it really, I hate to give a typical like economist answer, but I'll just say it depends. But one of the things it depends on is where their electricity is coming from. For instance, in Washington State and in the greater Northwest, most public power utilities get, I would say, half or more of their generation from the Bonneville Power Administration. And then, of course, there are the Mid-Columbia utilities who provide almost, I think, all of their own generation and maybe even have surpluses in some cases. But there's a lot of what we would call legacy hydropower out there that has helped keep electricity rates down for many public power customers. The rub is this nexus that we're coming to now, where we are seeing pockets of very big demand growth for energy from, let's say, data centers or from electrification, and there is no more hydropower to go around, right? There's the rub, is like you've run out of your legacy hydropower. And there's even some people out there who against good reason want to get rid of some of that legacy hydropower. And so, you have a really big challenge there it's like, okay, for any load growth that we're going to see now, all of a sudden, the cost is going to go way up. And again, it depends on who you are and what utility you are. But let's say, I think the BPA average power supply for a consumer-owned utility is around 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And I think to go out and buy similar product in the market would probably be, and I haven't been out in the wholesale markets for a long time, but I think it would probably be 3 times as high as that. If you want shaped and firm delivered electricity, it's going to be much, much higher. So, and then to do that on a carbon-free basis, very hard. So I think that that is going to be an extreme challenge. Now, the IOUs in the region, the investor-owned utilities, they don't have as much legacy hydropower, and so for them, converting their natural gas plants or getting rid of coal, and they have even an additional cost, right? Because now they're getting they're getting rid of these plants that they have used to balance the system for years, and they're going to have to replace that in addition to meeting new demand. So I think it's going to be really challenging for them. And actually, just one last thing I will say, if you look at like my former utility, Portland General Electric, they've come under a lot of scrutiny because I think their rates have increased 40% total over the past 5 years. I mean, that's a big increase, right? And not all of it, but at least a significant portion of it is attributable to them having to decarbonize the grid.
Another thing that doesn't seem to be brought up is that oftentimes, in order to get something pure, it's like you can purify water to make it safe for drinking and everything, but it's going to be 99.9.
Yeah.
Trying to go to 100%, the amount of cost, the added cost of doing some of these
Yes.
things to get that extra, squeeze out that extra, 6, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1%, can be astronomical, and you might achieve
it's exponential. It is literally exponential to get that, to wring out that last few megawatts, right? But E3 is a really respected analytics group that did a study before CETA passed, and basically they said that Washington State, I think it was focused on Washington State, could achieve like an 80% decarbonized grid without a huge exponential, or without a huge jump in electricity rates. They said trying to go from 80% to 100%, that's when the costs essentially become asymptotic. Like the curve just goes straight up.
Right.
And so I think that's one place where we would have preferred what I think would be a more reasonable path, instead of making a 100% mandate. While it sounds good on the surface, the costs are just so much higher. I don't know that you're getting your customers your money worth.
So actually, I think that just hits on one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Kurt, which is, maybe you just recommended it. It's like if there was 2 or 3 things that we could do in Washington and the Pacific Northwest to decarbonize to some extent, but within reason, keep prices low and create reliability. Like if we're going to be 2 or 3 things that you could do to achieve those 3 goals in some balance, what would you do?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I do think that there needs to be a rule that if you're going to get rid of a plant with, what I would say on-demand characteristics, right? Like a coal or natural gas plant,
Or a dam.
Yeah, or yes, or absolutely, or a dam. That you have to, that you have to replace it with generation with similar characteristics. And if that generation with similar characteristics doesn't exist, then you're not ready to get rid of that project yet. I mean, I really do. I just think I think it's the most basic thing in the world. The other thing is, I do think nationally, and not as much regionally, but even regionally, I think we have made, and Todd, you know this, we've made great strides as a nation decarbonizing by just switching from coal to natural gas generation. And there's still so much of that one could do, let's say in the East Coast. There's a lot of coal generation there. And if resources were focused, I mean, maybe 80% of renewable or, carbon-free is good enough for Washington State, then somehow, we should be looking at these other states. And, coal has some pollutants that aren't not just carbon, but that can be harmful to human health and things like that. So is there an opportunity to, as the nation, then, move away from this kind of state by state path to something that looks more nationally at, okay, where are the resources best used? And I feel like we're going to get to a point in Washington State, if we're not already there, where we've kind of gotten our dollar value out of the change, right? And now what about some of these other states where a shift to natural gas could be a huge boon in terms of both reducing pollution, but also keeping things economic. So I think overall, when people ask me, I think that's something that I really think is a possibility. And then I don't know if I have a third one yet, but those are my first two.
We're speaking with Kurt Miller. He's the Executive Director and CEO of NWPPA, that's the Northwest Public Power Association, and Washington Policy Center's Vice President for Research, Todd Myers. Todd, one of the things that was pointed out earlier was that, there's a lot of people pushing, their value, which is they want a zero carbon because they fear climate change, and that's their number one priority. What would you say to those who think that that making a zero carbon emission electrical grid, should be the top priority if that is their value? How would you convince them otherwise?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, for those who that is their value and that's what they believe, then okay, fine, but let's do that in the smartest way. If the way that they want to do it is going to increase the number of blackouts, then probably it's not politically sustainable. What we just saw in the most recent Canadian elections was that they got rid of the federal carbon tax because it was an election and it was politically unpopular. So if the consequences of your carbon policies are to make a whole lot of people angry, then you're, cutting off your nose to spite your face. Now, what we have argued is that there are lots of ways to reduce CO2 emissions in sort of a holistic way, sort of what Kurt talked about nationally, but you can do that in a holistic way locally. So, you have 80% of your generation, you have nuclear, you have hydro, you have wind and solar that is, low carbon or carbon free, and then the rest of it is for reliability. That keeps costs down as well. Then you create a political climate where you've achieved the vast majority of your goal without having to, put undue costs and things like that. And there's a big difference between putting a wind turbine where it's windy and putting a solar panel on somebody's rooftop in Seattle, right? Washington State has horrible amount of solar generation. Rooftop solar is the most expensive form of solar because more of that cost goes into the brackets and putting it on the roof rather than the technology, which the price has come down. And so even, among those who want to do 100% carbon free, there are things you can do where you choose technologies that actually make sense here, like wind where it's windy, and don't choose the, putting solar panels on top of parking garages or houses or things like that, where the expense is absolutely astronomical. So I think the key thing is to keep your eye on the goal. What's the goal? If the goal is to decarbonize, if the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, then make that the goal. If the goal is, some sort of political agenda to say we have, zero emission electricity, then what you're going to get is extremely expensive electricity, and you're going to have more blackouts, whether you like it or not. And I think you don't need to go to that sort of extreme unless the value of climate policy is to make you feel righteous rather than actually to help the planet.
Yeah, I think it's really well said, Todd. I think it was in 2022, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they released a report on climate policy. And one of the things that they said is the greatest risk to climate policy is if it becomes so expensive that it leaves vulnerable communities behind. Because people, they said, will rightfully essentially protest. And policymakers will pay attention to those protests because they would like to be policymakers still, and that you could end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think we're getting really close to that. Again, mentioning my former utilities rate increase over the last 5 years of 40%. That's not that we're seeing that at a lot of the investor-owned utilities, some really, really steep increases because some of the mandates that we've been talking about today. And at a certain point, people, it doesn't matter if you have clean electricity if you can't afford to use it, right? And so I think that affordability has to play a bigger factor into some of these policy decisions.
And I think there are people in Washington State who say, "Oh, we are immune to all of that." Well, that's what Canada thought too, and they had to get rid of it. And then, of course, now you see the Trump administration and the budgets coming out of the federal government that will have an impact on us because nationally those policies are not popular. But even here in Washington State, we see sensitivity to that. Last year, the state legislature allocated, I think it was $150 million for support for low-income families to help pay for their electricity bills going into an election where the CO2 tax was on the ballot. In this budget, there's no 150 million. It's down to 25 million. So they know, right? The fact that they gave that subsidy last year, not this year, indicates that when there is political peril, they understand the risk.
Right. And I like how you guys have phrased it too. It's because we do know that, especially in the Puget Sound area and kind of in west of the I-5 corridor, climate policy really matters to people. And so I really do like how you guys are phrasing that. It's what is the priority there within that? How do we make those who are really concerned about carbon and climate? How do we work? Help them work to achieve something that is beneficial for society and doable from an affordability perspective.
Yeah, if we can address those concerns and make things more affordable for everybody, then it's a win-win for all. I want to turn to some of the audience questions before we run out of time together. This is from Eric, and you may or may not be able to help him, but he wants comment from either of you if you could describe what happened in Spain and Portugal with their outage and whether there was any lessons there for Washington State or our area.
I know a little bit about that, Todd, but have you followed that fairly closely, or?
Yeah, there's no question that the fact that Spain and Portugal, the sort of the Iberian Peninsula, relies heavily on renewables, and that contributed to it. It puts stress on the grid. I think it's always difficult to, especially in foreign countries, to disentangle all of the various factors. But their own reports indicated that the intermittency of wind in particular put them in a situation where it was very hard to adjust, and they had some serious blackouts as a result of it.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that, and I think everything you said was accurate, the one thing I would add to it is, I think they said at the time that their grid, when the unplanned blackout happened, I think their grid was operating 60% renewable, wind and solar.
Yeah.
And the rub, and you can see, and you've actually seen things like this here. the rub is that their wind and solar aren't operating on with what we would call smart inverters. And so they can respond to a deviation in grid frequency in a really negative way. And one of the challenges with traditional inverters and wind and solar power is that they aren't large machines. They don't like with a normal gas, let's say gas turbine, if you're turning it off, they have inertia. That's the word that they use in the electric industry. They have inertia so that as the plant's turning off, it's spinning it slowly of a great big machine, and it kind of helps support the grid. If the wind plant or the solar plant trip off, and they don't have smart inverters, they just are all gone simultaneously. There is no buffer there is no inertia to keep the machine, the great big machine of the grid going. And that's one of the big challenges that we're going to have to face here in this country, is you get higher penetration rates of wind and solar.
Yeah, I think, and that I think is just sort of the general theme, which is complexity increases.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have technology to deal with increasing complexity. We have one of the best companies in the world, Schweitzer, who can deal with that complexity. But complexity means that the risk of things going wrong, it increases, and you're going to have those sorts of problems.
And it's more complex, and it costs more, because if you want smart inverters, now you are increasing the cost of your generation. So they all tie together. More complex equals more costly.
Question from Frank. He says, I understand China's kilowatt hour cost is 15 cents and ours is higher. This has significant implications for competitiveness in the world economy. Do either of you have any comment on that?
In the Northwest, if you're served by a public power utility, especially Washington State, I think that your average electricity rate is around 11 cents. And that is basically wholly attributable to hydropower. So you are welcome. But you're right. I mean, I think that is like on California, on the other hand, I don't even know what their electricity rates are anymore. But obviously, I think they're in the neighborhood of, is it 70, 80 cents? I'm not really sure, but it's really high on average for the investor-owned utilities there. And so obviously you have a lot of business leaving the Golden State as a result. So yeah, there's absolutely there is going to be a cause and effect if we can't keep electricity rates affordable. And President Trump has been very clear about that. He wants to win the AI, kind of the AI arms race, for lack of a better phrase. And to do that, you're going to have reliable, affordable, abundant electricity. And I think he very much is focused on that.
And I think this is one of the challenges that we have in Washington State, which is that when California runs into shortages, they buy hydro on the spot market from us. And so it sort of works out nicely because our summers are mild and their summers are hot. And so sometimes we don't need all of the capacity that we have. But there are times when they compete with us, and when California's prices are, I think they are now the most expensive in the country. The last time I checked, I think, and they're competing with us, who actually have relatively low prices. We start to have to compete on the spot market, which is for the last little percentage of electricity in those high demand periods, with a super expensive market. So that becomes a challenge in how you manage not just Washington State policy, but regional policy.
Well, before we run completely out of time, Todd, I know that you have a publication out tomorrow discussing the projects of the Climate Commitment Act, and I wanted to ask you briefly if you can tell us, just give us a tease about what viewers should expect to come out tomorrow.
So one of the factors that we've talked about in terms of regulation that's running, we talked about CETA, which is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, I think is, if I'm getting the acronym right, which requires 100% renewable by 2030. And then there's another more strict 2045. But the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act, which puts the CO2 tax, which also impacts energy prices. But the state has generated about $4 billion in revenue from that, and they're spending it. And so what what I did was look at the operating side, how some of that money is being spent in the most recent operating budget for 25-27. And we'll be releasing that tomorrow. Just as a tease, what you will see is you'll see a lot of claims that that money goes to reduce CO2 emissions. And in fact, when you look at actually what they're spending on, the vast majority of it does nothing to reduce CO2 emissions. But we'll be releasing that tomorrow.
Can't wait to see that and compare it to, there was a release today from another group that was supportive of the Climate Commitment Act, if I remember, essentially pointing to these projects as triumphs.
Yeah.
It'll be fun to compare the two.
Yeah, well, the Clean and Prosperous Institute, I think, is what they're called. They put out a report saying that, oh, this money is being spent in these great local projects. It should be noted that one of those great local projects that is being spent money on goes specifically to the Clean and Prosperous Institute. So they profit from the CCA. So it's not surprising that they think that the money is being spent fantastically.
Yeah, that tends to do it. Real quickly, we have one more question that came in for Kurt. Of your 154 member utilities, what's the percentage of baseload dispatch able and intermittent power offered by those utilities? And how do you assess the availability, reliability, and affordability of the power offered by member utilities? Now, that might be too much for you, but any comment you can give to.
Yeah, so that would require some research on my behalf. I would say that about half of our utilities are what we would call distribution utilities, which means that they generally don't have their own generation. Many of those, especially in the Northwest, are going to be full requirements customers of the Bonneville Power Administration. So they essentially enter long-term contracts with BPA to get power at cost from the hydropower system and the Columbia Generating Station. So that's so a lot of them aren't going to have that, but they get that through BPA or potentially maybe Western Area Power Administration, which is a similar organization to BPA. Then we have some of the larger utilities as well who are members. And they are, all looking, they're all challenged by this need to get to 100% clean energy standard. I think the most interesting one out there who looks like they have a chance to do it is Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They're in California, of course, but they were already had a very high renewable base. They have hydropower, they have wind, solar, and they have entered a deal to convert a old Calpine natural gas plant and to convert it or add carbon, what do they call it, carbon capture and sequestration. And so this project will, in theory, be enough to allow them, once that carbon is captured from the gas plant and sequestered, that should be enable them to actually get to 100% renewable, kind of the hard way. So I think that's really interesting. We have other, large utilities in the Northwest. They have a lot of hydropower. So I'm kind of going name by name, but I would just say that our membership varies greatly. But because we have so many distribution utilities, most of them, on average, won't own very much generation.
Thank you. Now, I do want to point out to everyone, if you missed part of this episode or if you have a friend you'd like to share it with, you can always catch our full episodes on our YouTube channel. You can find it easily by going to our homepage, and you can go to our Watch Now, our new Watch section at washingtonpolicy.org. Very easy to find there, or head off to YouTube and find Washington Policy Center channel there. We have links to that on our webpage, very easy to get to. And we do that every other week here on Washington Policy on the Go, every week during the legislative session. I want to thank Kurt Miller, the Executive Director and CEO of the NWPPA, the Northwest Public Power Association, for coming on. It's always a pleasure. I know it's always a risk, to come on an organization's podcast or vlog when it's not your own, but I appreciate the education you provided.
You guys did a great job. I mean, I have all the respect in the world, obviously for Todd, who I've worked with a long time, and David, you did a great job. And I love that you're looking for practical solutions. And I think we can't be afraid to, in a polite way, push back on policies that do have challenges. And so I appreciate that you guys are doing that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And Todd, as always, love having you on. And I'm looking forward to the release tomorrow and the comparison of what the Climate Commitment Act projects are really funding, especially after a rather creative election season speaking about that particular tax and its priorities. So looking forward to that. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you share this with your friends and take part in our July Drive for Freedom. If you know someone who values free market reform in Washington State, if you know someone who values the work of Washington Policy Center, I hope you'll encourage them to join Washington Policy Center. It's easy. Just go to our July Drive for Freedom, go to washingtonpolicy.org. It's right there at the top of the page. They click, become a member, and support a drive for more freedom here in Washington State and freedom and prosperity that free market reform brings. So join us, get your friends to join us, and let's unite our voices together for change in Washington. And we'll see you all in a short, 2 weeks here on Washington Policy on the Go.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.